Paul Laurence Dunbar was born in Dayton, Ohio, to Joshua Dunbar and Matilda Murphy. Matilda was enslaved near Shelbyville, Kentucky, until emancipation in 1865, just 1 year before the Dunbar couple would meet in Dayton. Historians know little regarding Joshua's early life before the war. He did, however, escape Kentucky, where he was enslaved and fled to Canada through the Underground Railroad network. After hearing of the first colored infantry regiments in Massachusetts, regiments of freed people of color, he made his way back to the United States, enlisting in the 55th Infantry Regiment. Joshua served until 1865, having risen to the rank of sergeant. Matilda, who lacked Western education as a child, instilled in her son Paul the value of education by enrolling herself in night classes at the 10th District School on Zeger Street. Paul attended Central High School, where he edited the school newspaper, was a member of the literary and debate societies, and was class poet and class president. At 16 years of age, alongside future aviator Orville Wright, Dunbar also published and edited a newspaper made for West Dayton's African American community. The Dayton Tattler was Dunbar's first publication.
He is such a complicated figure. I'm going to not touch the fact that he was an abusive husband and very problematic things there, and the tragedy of his alcoholism. And, somehow someone told him that drinking was going to help his TB. But Paul Laurence Dunbar was born in Ohio after the end of slavery. His parents had been enslaved, but he himself never lived in the South, never experienced these things that he wrote a lot of poems about in dialect. And he was writing at a time when in Indiana, there were poets who were getting a lot of attention for writing in sort of the idiom of that place, sort of a Hoosier voice. And also in the 19th century, there's a real fascination with the idea of the folk, right? People probably know that from the Hungarian dances and settings like that, right? So I think that all of that was part of the soup in which he was swimming, that he found that there was an audience for his recitations of dialect poetry, and he made a name for himself as a reciter of poems.
Dunbar hoped to either attend college or secure a job in journalism upon graduating from high school, but he did not have enough money for additional education, and job prospects for a young African American were limited in Dayton at the time. He eventually secured a position as an elevator operator for the Callahan Building in downtown Dayton, where he notoriously sold some of his writing. In his spare time, Dunbar continued writing poetry and short stories, receiving a fortuitous break in 1892 when a former teacher invited him to speak at the convention of the Western Association of Writers in Dayton. A review of Dunbar's poems, especially those in dialect, was published in New York City's Harper's Weekly by prominent literary critic William Dean Howells in 1896. This brought Dunbar national acclaim, and shortly thereafter, he began touring the United States and Great Britain to deliver public readings.
Like I was saying, the folk voice was something that was important across art forms, regions, nations, continents, etc. at that point. And I think that certainly it was a way to bring in voices that were excluded. I also think it was a different political moment in that I don't know that that was necessarily an act of resistance so much as perhaps artistic individuality. So for example, the poem When Melindy Sings is really about the mastery of music within vernacular Black singing that even somebody who rehearses for a long time, you can hear this poor white woman trying to rehearse. It's just not going to sound the same, right? So that's a big claim about Black creativity and about the expertise of vernacular voices, right? So I do think that mattered to him. And he was published in part because of the interest that a white poet and influential literary professor, William Howell, took in his work. He also published a number of these smaller collections in volumes where they were illustrated by photographs taken by students at Hampton, at HBCU in Virginia, where they had a photography club or program and stuff.
In 1897, Dunbar accepted a job as a research assistant at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. However, as his literary success grew, his health deteriorated, and he soon left the job. After a stormy engagement, Paul eloped with fellow poet and activist Alice Ruth Moore, whom he courted for several years chiefly by letter. They married in New York on March 6, 1898. Shortly after, Dunbar was diagnosed with tuberculosis. This diagnosis, in an age without antibiotic medications, disrupted his relationship with Alice. Dunbar was given what was at the time a common prescription for the side effects of tuberculosis: alcohol. His alcoholism and continued abuse of Alice led her to leave him in 1902. Although she refused to have contact with Paul for the remainder of his life, the couple did not divorce. Alice retained his name and promoted his writing until her death in 1934.
So we're post-slavery, and this Reconstruction period, you know, when Black folks are exploding. His relationship with his wife, his marriage to Alice Ruth Moore, is our first example of an epistolary romance between two Black free people. And there are 360 some odd letters. And they're rubbing shoulder. It's the who's who of Black movers and shakers at that time. They writing about, at one point, you know, because Paul is a philanderer, and Alice is writing him saying, you know, Harry Burley told me not to talk to you. And Paul is writing back like, he needs to shut up. I mean, of course, it's so eloquently said, right? And the way that he falls in love with his wife is he sees one of her printed poems, because she's a force of her own. She's a Delta, and wrote the words to the hymn. So I connected to her that way, a member of my sorority. And he saw one of her poems printed, and this pretty little light-skinned Creole girl, and fell in love and wrote her a letter. I mean, these letters are gorgeous. He says to her at one point, I would rather be your captive than another woman's king. But he's not, you know, but it's not the healthiest relationship. They don't know each other, right? I mean, most of their relationship is spent apart. They're both very formal and Victorian. And so there's these lovely, like, you know, handwritten letters. But at the end of the day, you know, he's got some drinking issues and some little philandering issues. And he is a bit abusive in some ways, and he definitely assaults her. And there's a whole series of letters where they're putting together the story that they're going to tell people. His work and this era of just, it's not a renaissance yet. It's the birth. It's not the rebirth. It's the birth. It's the birth of free Black thought. It's right then. And it's amazing to see come to fruition in his personal writings and in his letters to other artists, composers, and writers, and in his interactions with his wife, who was his muse, and who was fierce in her own right and wrote some beautiful poetry.
He also wrote a huge number of poems in kind of almost archaic standard English that were not particularly interesting or popular with the primarily white audiences who were attending these recitations. They wanted to hear this exotic music in the same way that people wanted to hear the Fisk Jubilee singers sing authentic Black music. But Black composers have been among the primary scholars of his standard poems, his standard English poems. I do know that he felt disappointed by the fact that his standard English poems were not taken seriously. And for example, he wrote tributes to people like Frederick Douglass in standard English that are just as important for asserting the dignity and significance of Black culture as the dialect poems, but haven't been adopted in this kind of representative way as some of the other works have.
He's such a rapper this way. Okay. He's a rapper in one way because the way he becomes famous is he's hustling and he's selling his poetry books while he's an elevator operator. He's literally master P-ing this experience. He is like selling CDs out of his trunk. So that's the first way that it hits me that he's in this kind of genre. And the other reason is because of this. He comes about in this era of the plantation tradition, right? So people are writing in dialect. He's not doing something new per se. And he's not the last. He's not the first and he's not the last. He does it in a very effective way. But he comes about in this time where writers are really wanting to make America great again. And talking about how happy the darkies were on the plantation and life was simpler then, and we were all happier then, right? And so, you know, of course, there's this recreation of the way that slaves spoke that was present in literature. And so Paul is like a conscious rapper. Like he's still got a gold chain or two, but if you listen, he's saying something, right? He's like Tupac kind of, right? So here comes Paul using this dialect, but he's talking about you. Wait a minute, you know, he's giving some scathing critical commentary about the world.
Coleridge Taylor at that time, having been raised by his white mother in Britain and never having met his father, who was a doctor from Sierra Leone, you know, he's trying to figure out as a young man in his 20s what it means to be an adult of color in a society that might have had space for you as like a 12-year prodigy, but are going to have different feelings about you when you're dating whoever it is that you date in a country where there are not very many Black people, right? So part of what appealed to him was Dunbar's references to race in his music. They had a multivalent relationship to each other in a way that Coleridge Taylor did not have to to Longfellow. So that's important as well, that this is a relational musical form in so many ways. And that is a model for a way of being together that I think we need and that we have had and that we need to bring forward at a time like this. Yeah.
For me, landing in Dayton and discovering Dunbar and realizing how many of the underrepresented composers that I love so much found their voices in him. That was it. He's in the air a bit here. You drive by and you see this Black guy on this mural. And so his name is on, you know, his house is still standing. And I want to say it's the first, it's definitely in the state of Ohio, the first one for a Black American, but it's now a Ohio historic site. I wished I had known more about Paul, and so I made it my business that wasn't going to happen for other singers. You were going to know whose voice that was. You were going to know, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings is Paul and not Maya, and that she was inspired by him. Yes, she named a poem that, and her autobiographical work, whatever. I'm not sure if she wrote it or somebody else, but I Know Why the Cage Bird Sings. And that is from a poem called Sympathy. And it is by Paul Laurence Dunbar. I call him your favorite poet's favorite poet. Mm-hmm. So when I got here, I thought, oh, I'm going to do a completely poetry oriented recital. Maybe I'll do Goethe. No, I should do somebody American. Who's this Dunbar guy? And that's how it started. And I grew up with my mother reading me. She read me Langston Hughes. I remember her reading me those at bedtime. And so when I began to really delve into his poetry, I realized I recognized quite a bit of it, but I also heard the echoes of his voice in the writings of Langston. And of course, his influence on Zora Neale Hurston. And I mean, I loved the dialect. I loved the code switch. I loved it, and grew up an hour from here. And so I felt like I had a real literal connection to the Black folks of this place in this country. And I thought, well, I think I'm probably a good translator here. It's coming from a church tradition, studying with Black teachers who had me pretty well versed in some of the literature. I mean, I went to Michigan, that's where Willis Patterson is. And you know, if you've got a book of songs by Black composers, you probably got that Patterson book, right? So the legacy was there for me. And then Paul sucked me in. Like I just was trying to have a recital. I happened to be teaching, once again, nothing wasted. I happened to be teaching a young lady who is still very near and dear to my heart, a young soprano. And I had a little master class for my private studio, and her grandfather came, and he gave such insightful feedback. And I thought, oh, this man's an artist. Well, it turns out this was Herbert Woodward Martin, Dunbar scholar, editor, and performer. And so I thought, Herb, what if we do this recital where I'm going to sing, because you know I got to have a gimmick. I'm going to sing, Herb, and then you speak. And then I sing, and then you speak. It's been a very unique journey, me coming into Dunbar. I founded the Dunbar Music Archive in 2014. It's a searchable online database of poems by Paul Laurence Dunbar, and including musical settings of those poems. It's an online searchable database, the DMA is, and then the glossary is going to be an online glossary functioning as a part of the database, so that you'll be able to hear a dialect term, see the definition, see the IPA, which is what I'm really working on. I'm IPAing dialect terms, and then the poetic reference, so you get it in some context. And then there's streaming audio, so you can hear it. I realized very quickly that, you know, you have to hear Dunbar. You have to hear Paul's I mean, he wrote standard English, gorgeous, balanced, elegant standard English poems. And some of my favorite works by him are his standard English, but he also wrote these incredibly engaging and vivid and insightful works in dialect. And that whole tradition is oral. Like, you need to hear it. I remember the first time that I looked at the dialect poems, because, you know, I came into it thinking, oh, well, you know, I'm Black, I can do this. It's not going to be a big deal. And you look at it, it looks like another language. It really does. So this is the Dunbar Music Archive. And it's got a bit of just an introductory page that is just kind of letting you know what the archive is itself. And if you wanted to delve a bit more into Paul's life, which is incredible. So here is the actual archive. I am going to play for you a Negro love song because it's one of my favorite poems by him. It's dialect. And it's got a call and response feature to it that's a lot of fun. My mentor Herb thinks it is officially the first rap song ever composed. But if you notice, you will see that there are musical settings of this poem. There is a streaming audio here at the top of the page, and then the text to the poem underneath. And of course, my person doing my recordings is none other than Herbert Woodward Martin, right? Because he's a specialist in his field and just incredibly gifted in the area.
A Negro love song
Of recitation. Here he goes.
I seen my lady home last night. Jump back, honey, jump back. I held her hand and I squeezed it tight. Jump back, honey, jump back. I heard a sigh, a little sigh. I seen a light gleam from her eye and a smile go flitting by. Jump back, honey, jump back. I heard the wind blow through the pines. Jump back, honey, jump back. The mockingbird was a-singing fine. Jump back, honey, jump back. And my heart was beating so when I reached my lady's door that I couldn't bear to go. Ooh, jump back, honey, jump back. Now I put my arm around her waist. Oh, jump back, honey, jump back. I raised her lips and took a taste. Ooh, jump back, honey, jump back. Love me, honey, love me true, love me well as I love you. And she answered, 'cause I do. Jump back, honey, jump back.
But if you listen to When Melindy Sings, basically this woman is saying, you know, you got this music book and you're doing all this practicing and all them lines and dots and you don't sound good. And that's literally what the poem is about. It's like, no, you need to, you need to hear Melindy. Melindy sings down. But it's this response that says, you aren't better than me. You ain't no better than me. The subtext, and he's using the same tradition, right? These kind of similar tropes. But before we get too uppity about it, you know, I'll get in my car and WAP comes on and I'm bumping. Okay, so how stuck up do we have to be here? Okay, so Dunbar was making money. He was doing the minstrel music to pay the bills, and try to change things and say some things. But he dabbles in the minstrelsy a bit that way. And so if you're not careful, it'll turn you off the surface of it. Because if you're not listening, you're not hearing what he's saying in his poetry, which is every man is a king.
When Melindy Sings. Now go away and quit that noise, Miss Lucy. Put that music book away. What's the use to keep on trying if you practice till you great? Because you can start no notes of flying like the ones that rants and rings from the kitchens to the big woods when Melindy sings. And you ain't got the natural organs but to make the sound come right. And you got the turns and the twists but to make it sweet and light. Now I'm telling you one thing, Miss Lucy, and I am telling you for true. When it comes to real right singing, it ain't no easy thing to do. Easy enough for folks to holler looking at the lines and the dots when ain't no one can sense it and the tune comes in spots. But for real melodious music, just strikes your heart and clings. Just you stand here and listen with me when Melindy says, ain't you never heard Melindy? Bless soul, take up the cross. Look here, ain't you joking, honey? You don't know what you done lost. You ought to hear that gal a-wobbling, robins, larks, and all them things. Hush they mouth and hides they faces when Melindy sings. Fiddling man just stops his fiddling and lay his fiddle on the shelf. And the mockingbird quits trying to whistle cause he just so ashamed of himself. And folks are playing on the banjo, straps their fingers on the strings, and bless your soul, forgets to move them when Melindy sings. Now she just spreads her mouth and hollers, come to Jesus. Twirl you hear sinners, trembling steps and voices, timid like, are drawing near. And then she turns to Rock of Ages. Simply to the cross she clings, and you find your tears are dropping when Melindy sings. Now who that says that humble praises with the master never counts? Hush your mouth, I hear that music as it rises and it mounts, floating by the hills and valleys way above this burying sod, as it makes its way in glory to the very gates of God. Oh, it's sweeter than the music of an educated band, and it's dearer than the battle song of triumph in the land. And it seems holier than evening when solemn church bells ring, as I calmly sit and listen while Melindy sings. Towser, you stop that barking, you hear me? Mandy, make that child keep still. Don't you hear the echoes are calling from the valleys to the hills? Let me listen. I can hear it through the brush of angels' wings, soft and sweet. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. Swing low, as Melindy sings.
And if you are lucky, and I'm sure it's probably on YouTube, Cicely Tyson recited this at Aretha Franklin's funeral. It is one of the, I was on my floor, I was on the floor. I was on the floor. What her genius brought to it, and in honor of that great voice. Yeah, so this is When Melindy Sings. And as you can see, she's basically saying, Miss Lucy, you can't sing. And you so fancy with all your learning books, and you can't sing. And that message comes back over and over.
Paul Laurence Dunbar stands out as the first poet from the Negro race in the United States to show a combined mastery over poetic material and poetic technique, to reveal innate literary distinction in what he wrote, and to maintain a high level of performance. He was the first to rise to a height from which he could take a perspective view of his own race. He was the first to see, objectively, its humor, its superstitions, its shortcomings, the first to feel sympathetically its heart wounds, its yearnings, its aspirations, and to voice them all in a purely literary form. From the Book of American Negro Poetry by James Weldon Johnson, American civil rights activist and writer.